All right, welcome everyone. Tēnā koutou katoa, hama mai toi hangaro, Geospatial Research Institute. It's my real pleasure to introduce somebody we've been working with for a few years now. JohnReid here is involved in the running of the GRI in some way as well, in terms of its strategic research directions. So we talk with him quite a bit. And one of the things that we have been speaking about from being involved in the last few years is something that you'll be talking about today, John. John is a senior research fellow in the Ngāi Tahu Research Institute at the University of Canterbury. And you're an economist by background, really, environmental economist. Close enough. And do you want to introduce anything about yourself, John?
Yep, sure. Well, kia ora koutou. Kota mihi ki te mana whenua te rohi nei, riri no ngā whiki o nei tainui o JohnReid toko wingoa. It's the presentation up.
I will bring the presentation up.
Yeah.
Sound's not coming through. Uh-oh. It's coming through. John's mic. It is coming through online. Do it like that. Is that better? Yep. All good. Okay. All right. So John, got me in control of this technology, eh? Share that. Do that. Do that. Should be good to go. Get this out of the way. You don't. All right, John, over to you. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. So where to start? What's become apparent to me over the last few years, I do have a background more so in environmental sustainability auditing and how that links to business, and in particular how you measure changes on the ground. I worked mostly in the farming, forestry and fishing sectors, and I've worked strongly with iwi and hapu in that regard, and particularly marae-based communities is often where I tended to focus my efforts. And one thing that has really stood out to me is the kind of fragmented landscape we have here in New Zealand around environmental monitoring, sort of a lack of a bigger grand picture, so to speak, of how all the parts can fit together. At the same time, there's been sort of a revolution in new technologies. There's new monitoring technologies, artificial intelligence, and so forth. And so I got some resourcing from the Our Land and Water Science Challenge to basically theorize, or almost like a white paper, the creation of an environmental sensing network that was kind of constructed and built incorporating Indigenous modes of thinking and ways of operating. So this is where the origin of this comes from. And underneath this is a whole team. GRI has done a significant body of the work, which we'll get into. And so thanks to Matt and the team. Else. So the first thing is just to kind of explore the need for environmental data. And sort of our focus was we were funded out of the Māori related research component of Our Land and Water. And so those are our two principal foci in the first place. And the first is Māori agribusiness collectives. So you've got a growing segment in New Zealand of Māori agribusinesses. These are from both Māori landowners, but also from iwi, post-settlement iwi, going through their settlement processes. And many of those manage large tracts of land, farmland, forestry, and also marine estate. And what they have is their boards of trustees or directors, and they are looking for high quality, comprehensive, reliable, and frequent environmental data. And this is to get an idea that what they're doing aligns with their values, their Indigenous values and practices. And it's also, that they're operating according to their values. There's also the hapu and iwi scale. So most of you all know Ngāi Tahu. It's the main iwi or tribe here in the South Island of New Zealand. Once again, they have groups of tribal governors who are elected, but they also want high quality, comprehensive and reliable environmental data that covers their tribal territories. And this is for a couple of reasons. One is to formulate iwi environmental plans, and also so they can proactively engage with regional and local councils on environmental issues, and sometimes national government. So if they have good environmental data at hand and they're not relying on third-party sources, there's sort of an empowerment effect where they can progress their interests. So we ran into this with three main questions. What is the best mix of technologies needed to provide comprehensive environmental monitoring? What investments would Māori organisations need to make to build an intelligence platform? And what are the demands for environmental data across different sectors? And so these were the sectors. I've just outlined the first two, Māori Land Trusts and Corporations and iwi. But we're also looking at a third and fourth area. And that is, just to give you a little bit of background, the European Union just recently introduced its corporate sustainability reporting directive. What it means is that corporates, including corporates in New Zealand, if they're exporting to the EU, they need to report on their performance, particularly whether they're meeting their biodiversity impact. And you can imagine how that affects farming in New Zealand, particularly with our stream biodiversity and stream health. And they also need to meet various greenhouse gas emissions targets. And so what this means is that there's more and more pressure coming on our industries to undertake this type of environmental reporting and to have this environmental data and information. And under the EU regulation, they need to be regenerative by 2030. That is enhancing biodiversity and the way they undertake their farming, forestry practices. So what this means is that the corporate sector is kind of scared. They need to be able to report, and they need high quality data. And what you also have, you also have regulators inside New Zealand require data, and markets. So a lot of markets around the world, if consumers want to see that the products they're buying are sustainable, they also require data as well. And so we also wanted to look at what the needs are of these different sectors as well as the needs of the Māori entities. So that if Māori go ahead and start to build this or at least build this platform, and I'll talk about it later in a modular way, that they can also produce income from creating environmental data. So you can create a platform that is self-sustaining economically. So in terms of our research design, first question, what types of environmental data? We did deep literature review across Māori authorities, the assurance sector, banking and investment sector, premium markets, and we also did interviews and workshops with Māori authorities, assurance sector, banking, investment sector. And then we looked at the technologies, and we then worked with Māori collaborative partners to design a platform. And then we worked out how much the thing would cost to build. So I'm not sure how technically competent everyone is in the room, so I'll just do a very brief 101 on some of the types of technologies. I've got a bit of imposter syndrome at the moment. I'm not an engineer. Those are the things that I've been learning over the last few years, so hopefully I can do it justice. But generally speaking, over here we've got different types of vehicles, satellites or planes or drones in this instance, and they've got different sensors that pick up. Either they send something down to the ground, it bounces back up and something is sensed, or something being reflected off the ground, for example, sunlight, and that can be, we can detect what's happening on the ground. And we have different technologies like LiDAR, which is going to tell you the ground surface and structure. For example, here's forest canopy, the internal structure of a forest, which enables us to be able to determine things like species type and health within a forest, things like biomass or carbon accumulation. Also things like picking up elements like thermal elements, like whether the temperature of water and so forth. Then we go into the hyperspectral and multispectral areas. And another project that I'm leading called EcoIndex, we've had a partnership with the satellite company Planet, and where they've been providing us with very high quality hyperspectral imaging to do work across a number of areas, but which I'll go into a bit later. But what you can do with hyperspectral imaging is be able to determine from the ground using this reflection of the satellite imagery, things like biodiversity, water quality, erosion, soil compaction, soil nitrates and phosphates through chlorophyll reflectance, and things like if you're a farmer and you want to manage things, your fence lines, your stock numbers, and things like that. And also GNSSR reflectometry, measuring the soil moisture levels and so forth across the country. And that's part of the Rongawai project, which Matt is co-lead. Pretty much, yeah. And also we've had all these advances in situ sensing as well. You know, we've got our soil sensors, eDNA, measuring, you know, biological diversity within water, weather stations, camera traps, and acoustic sensors. So these sort of things are important for, you know, measuring biodiversity within forest areas. Here's just a quick outline of the type of data that's retrieved from eDNA sensors and outlining all the species within a river. And also we've got water sensors that are going to tell us a whole range of things too around water pH, nitrogen and phosphorus, sediments and temperature and pollutants. So the idea being, you know, lots of new advancing technologies that can detect a range of environmental factors. We've also had this advance in artificial intelligence. And so here I've just given one example of how it's applied. So here we have an optical satellite image. And what we do is you take the AI, and the AI can find patterns within that data. We then, in a sort of virtuous circle, take it down and ground truth it to make sure what we're seeing in the satellite matches what's on the ground. And it's an iterative process of identifying these patterns and teaching, you know, having the algorithm teaching the algorithm to be able to identify certain environmental variables. Out of that, over time, you can build out these libraries of environmental signatures. And this here is a bit of a list of the types of environmental signatures that our case study partners and the feedback we were getting through our research, the types of signatures that they wanted built over time. And without going through all of them, you know, native ecosystem types, biodiversity, taonga species, so sacred species from a Māori perspective, weed species, soil pH, you know, greenhouse gas emissions and so forth. The idea being that in time that you're able to gather huge amounts of data and then scrape that data to identify all the environmental signatures within that data to give you an overall picture of environmental health and production data if it's a production landscape across multiple indicators and metrics. So that's kind of the overarching picture or vision of how you bring that together. So here is an outline of what the environmental and biophysical data that our Māori agribusiness collectives and iwi want. So you can see a lot of them are pretty standard forms of data, environmental data, from native habitat, species diversity and so forth. I won't go through them all, but you can see they sit along an area down this end of it is more around production or production on land, farming, forestry, down to that end is with that pure environmental biophysical data, and also some cultural elements around wahitaonga, wahitapu, or areas that are important for from a cultural perspective. What we then went through, and this is probably Matt's team, was we took each of these key areas or the types of key indicators that or the type of key signatures that each that our case that all of our that emerged from our research, what each of them wanted to see, and we developed a series of modules. And then we looked at, in the first instance, how we could use remote sensing to generate the data that we want. Well, the reason we've focused mostly on remote sensing in the first instance is because it can go on scale and it can produce data much more cheaply at a per unit level. And where remote sensing couldn't do the job, then we would look for in situ or on-site data gathering. But in each case, so we went through, we were identifying a range of modules, and we were looking at the sources of data, how the data can be generated, and then we went through a build description. This is a high-level build description. I'll go through at the end there, we can go to the actual reports, which go into this in all detail. And then we assign difficulty levels to each of them, which is based on the amount of time it would take to build the technology. In each case, we've only used technologies that we know are being used or have been developed successfully overseas, so that we know that when applied to the New Zealand context, there's a pathway for its development without, without being too stretchy in the science, so that we're trying to focus on things that are realistic and deliverable. So once again, I won't go through all detail, but at a high level, we're looking at things like terrestrial biodiversity, soil stability and quality, water quality and quantity, and greenhouse gas emissions. And for our farmers, we're very interested in stock numbers. We then went through and we're looking at how do we implement the implementation of these modules. So as we'd broken them down into a series of modules that could be built, we then looked at how we might build them sequentially and how a prioritization process of what module should be built first and in what order based on the technical feasibility and the and priority. So some of those ones that were too hard, get pushed further down the list. And then working collaboratively with other Māori collectives, the government, science, and investment sectors, focusing on investment and building specific interoperable modules. So I'll go a little bit how we're starting to head down that track now. Now we sort of step into the mātauranga side, Māori knowledge side, and working in how we're building these sort of elements into our project. So once again, there's a process by which we can use mātauranga, Māori knowledge, first of all, of where we direct our senses or what type of information that we want to gather. And also a very important role in using mātauranga to identify environmental patterns. So when you're training AI, using Indigenous knowledge to train that AI to almost build what you might think are Indigenous forms of artificial intelligence, it might be indicating, different Indigenous ways of identifying indicators of environmental health, weather cycles, species migrations, life cycles, things like that. So that sort of knowledge can be built into the development process. And also having mātauranga in the ground truthing side, Indigenous, from that Indigenous perspective, that environmental pattern recognition is going to be different. And so how we can pick up on that environmental pattern recognition and train the artificial intelligence to recognize that Indigenous position. And so then leading to the development of indigenized libraries of environmental signatures, going back to that principle before, where you can large amounts of data being pulled in, and you also have indigenized signatures alongside standardized. Now, this is another area around how you build in Indigenous knowledge. So here I've used a pretty simple category between what you might say is codified knowledge. And so this would be, say, knowledge of when a certain species in a river migrates, which is, and that species is an indicator of environmental health. That's a sort of knowledge that might be codified because it's something you can identify and measure and so forth. And that can feed into your data storage. But there's also many forms of Indigenous knowledge which are non-codifiable. And when you're thinking around this, it's forms of intuitive insight regarding sentience of place. And there's a lot of mātauranga, Māori ways and worldviews and ways of thinking built around these sort of forms of knowledge. And it's thinking about non-human and intangible forms of environmental consciousness. So I'll just give you an example. Up in Tūhoi, within their environmental management plan, they have sightings of patu pairehi as a measurement of forest health, which is, well, the patu pairehi are fairies. And so you would not normally be incorporating, sort of that form of knowledge is, not widely recognised within science institutions, generally speaking, but still they've built those into their frameworks. And so there was sort of a recognition of these other forms of knowledge and how they're communicated and how they might be fed in terms of forms of karakia and pūrākau and other things into that structure. And once again, in terms of the protection of information and data, what stood out was around the, from a Māori position, was around the protection of that data. So that was data protection, the onshoring of the data layered security, permissions and access protocols for data segments, and rigorous security protocols for access, including authentication, authorization, and encryption. So you can see here that the way that it works, data flowing into being stored, it's then being processed, it's models and environmental signatures being built, and then that information is then going back and being stored. Sure, Matt could probe on that. Also, how we communicate the information. So you've got the data sitting there. How does one communicate it? Of course, there's digital dashboards, there's digital twins, but also how you indigenize that communication and augmented reality as well. The other thing we worked a lot on was how that information gets communicated to what audience. Every audience has a different information need, and they process it differently, and they think about it differently. So at one end of the spectrum, we had things like our regulators, our finance industry, our investors, and what types of information they required. It was more down the spectrum of biophysical data, and also production and financial data was required at that end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, we have ahika. So those are in Māori referred to as the home fire keepers, where they're mostly interested in the nature of their relationship with the environment, and that relationship is what's often referred to as tauutuutu, which means like a reciprocal, mutually enhancing relationship with the environment. And they were most interested on whether one was enhancing the modi, the health of the land, the life-generating capacity of the land, and how that impacted them in this cyclical way. So that once you're improving the health of the whenua, the land, and the environment, that in turn is enhancing in your own modi. So they're interested in the relational balances, and also whether the relationship was mana enhancing, whether the dignity of the land was being recognised, and whether, which in turn enhances our own dignity in that respect. And so we're interested in how you could embed that information within place-centered, non-codified knowledge as well. So that's right at that other end of the spectrum. So this might be video content, and I'll provide some imagery of this sort of stuff a bit later on. So this is just some brief things. I've had to blank people out because these are from the research itself. It's all the different types of data communication, how we communicate it to the different user. So this case is an elder, kaumātua, someone who's playing a pivotal governance role, and the types of information that they wanted to see. So mostly interested in things around basically seeing their values put into practice. But it's very, very, can't go into too much. These things are all contained within reports and so forth to view. But, really concerned about the health of the land generally, loss of biodiversity, sense of cultural disconnection. So how this technology might be used to connect people who live in urban areas who are disconnected from their whenua, from their place, and a lot of links into education and so forth, and schools and this sort of thing. So when you start looking at it from this perspective, or through that viewpoint, it starts to open up the multiple ways in which the data is used. Once again, here we have a chair of a board. Same instance again, has a whole range of different environmental data requirements, and a farm manager. So in terms of the platform, this is how it how it appeared, it emerged in terms of an overarching design. So at the top, we've got the various types of data gathering technologies in terms of the spatial. Across the top, and then of course we have some in situ here in the middle, and process of modeling over here, and then how these are then taken out to processing out to a user interface. And this is how it appeared from the Te Ao Māori perspective. So it became embedded within a Māori cosmological view in terms of how the technology was to be used. At the top, where we have our various sensors, so satellite, aircraft, and drone, and the types of technology being used, the types of sensing technology to be used, and then how that, also the on-ground in situ stuff, but then how they feed in to various modeling processes, and then how they can provide data or information according to structures or ways of thinking that fit with a Māori orientation, particularly various different environmental domains, and how culturally Māori break up the environment into environmental domains, so they can then be reporting against those various environmental domains. At the bottom is the human domain, and the cycle is showing this interaction between humans and that environmental domain, and the nature of that relationship, whether it's in balance or out of balance. So these are our various reports and publications. So the one on the far left is a review of our whole process we went through and the results of that process. This middle one is a paper produced by Matt, myself, and Kevin Cote. So this is a technical paper going into full detail, I think 300 references or something like that, going through all the technology and how we arrived at our design based on the current state of technology. Also, this one here about what are the environmental needs, environmental intelligence needs of Māori communities. So that's based on a deep literature review and also our case studies and so forth. And so just a little bit around some of the implementation and what we've been doing more recently. So Hina Moana Halo is a project that started a couple of years ago. The technical advisor to this program, it's actually was set up as several iwi came together and set up a corporate entity, Hina Moana Halo, and they were wanting to attract international investors into New Zealand for carbon plus credits. So that's carbon plus biodiversity plus social impact. And they have set up a range of investors ready to invest in New Zealand. And the whole idea behind this is that if we can attract international capital or investment to do ecosystem reconstruction here in New Zealand, that we have a vehicle for paying for New Zealand's nature-based solutions and the creation of new ecosystems being rebuilt in New Zealand, being paid for by companies that need to improve their environmental footprint. So we've set that up, and a lot of the principles and ideas underpinning the Kaitiaki Intelligence Platform are feeding into the monitoring, reporting, evaluation structures within Hina Moana Halo. Also, Eco-Index, so that's a parallel program that has informed Kaitiaki Intelligence Platforms and it's informing back again. But here is just one of the Eco-Index products. And this here, if you look at that, it shows the lighter the color, the higher the priority area for ecosystem reconstruction in a particular area to maximize biodiversity impacts and nature-based and ecosystem-based ecosystem services into an area. So the lighter color, once again, drawing on some of these ideas and principles. And with Eco-Index, there's been strong work with Te Arawa, Ngāi Tahu, and a range of different iwi across the country. So yeah, this is our team, multiple institutions across the country. University of Canterbury featuring pretty heavily here, but also a range of private, University of Waikato, Nature Positive, and a range of companies that work, independent company, agribusiness group limited and so forth, that all came together to complete the project. And this here is a video done by our communications person within the group, and she's also a fine artist, so she developed this to kind of symbolically represent the Kaitiaki Intelligence Platform, looking at the lines being the information flowing through the sensing, and this connection and enhancement of Māori within place, or life sustaining capacity of the earth. So yeah, that's an outline of the platform. So yeah, any questions?
Great to see it all come together.
Mm-hmm.
Any questions? If you're online, then please do add your comments in there. Any questions in the room? I think Vincent was figuring in how much it would cost.
Yeah. Yes. Yep. it was about 50 million. Yeah. Yeah. Just under. We felt that we could get reasonable resolution to farm scale across the country. Yeah. No, it's not. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, this isn't launching a new satellite. This is using
Yeah.
Māori agribusiness collective satellite.
Oh, there's at least a couple of thousand, but there is about 200 that are, you'd say, significant. Yeah. So we worked with two prominent ones. We have, it was also built on a project by Our Land and Water that we'd done a few years before, where we had 36. So we'd already had a pretty good idea, and we used a lot of the literature from that around environmental needs to inform that. But then we're using those larger collectives to test our ideas with. Yeah.
What's the priority for, or what's the next step in terms of the modules that will be developed? Have you got any plans in terms of funding coming in to get the first module done? Or
Yeah, so we have so we set up a charitable trust in the first instance, but we do have a range of iwi. So we've got about 20 registered at the moment that have shown an interest in investing, and so at the moment it's a matter of us. Well, I'm coordinating between all of them in terms of how we can build those first, get those first modules built. What we're thinking about, what we've been considering is which way is the appropriate way to do it. Whether each focuses on a module that's the highest priority to them, and then we collectivize those modules into a platform, or whether we try to work amongst all of them to prioritize and build them simultaneously. So that's where we're currently sitting.
That finally people online can hear the questions, so they're asking if you can repeat the question.
Okay, sure. Yep.
They can hear the evidence.
that's me. Need another mic.
Sorry, what was it? Oh, what level of accessible? We would hope that it would be, in the first instance, information that was as much orientated toward being a digital public good as possible. In some instances where iwi have information or data that I suppose might be sensitive or something that they wish to have protected, then that sort of information would be, of course, protected. The question is, you always get into this difficult position. It's like, which we've recently come across in EcoIndex as we commercialized those products was that the once the funding dries up, you're dependent on funding, and you make it public, then the private sector will take that and build build products off that, and you're left having to get your new funding round. Whereas sometimes if you're retaining that, retaining some of that intellectual property, then you have that ability to, draw investment and keep expanding. Particularly, as I was outlining earlier, the value of environmental data is going to increase exponentially as the regulatory environment requires accurate and high quality environmental reporting for the corporate sector, and including banks and investors and so forth. They're all going to have to be reporting on their footprint. So as that occurs, then just like how market intelligence data and the finance markets is highly valuable, environmental data will go down the same track, and there will be competition about who has the highest quality data and the most recent data in terms of what's happening in terms of the environment. So that's what I anticipate happening. It all depends on how strong that regulatory sector remains. At the moment, it's very strong, but you're seeing a lot of political pressure globally to pull these environmental constraints off industry that have been placed on them more recently. And so that is, sort of I suppose a key risk. It took 30 years just to get greenhouse gas emissions taken seriously and for decent measurements to be put in place for that. But anyway, hopefully that answers your question. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can I also ask where there might be opportunities for other land holders or organizations to become involved?
Yeah, sure. So we've got the website, kaitiakitanga.maori.nz, and there's a registration form in there, and so that they can pop in there and enter their details, and then they go into the register, and then over time we will bring that network together.
Okay, so another one here. Kia ora, John. Thank you. Just wondered if you have been in conversation with ICF members.
No.
Yes.
Yeah, John, I was great talk, and I was wondering how much Kaitiaki might care about the spatial scale and the spatial resolution of measurements. There's lots of interesting discussions, and we've had some of them too about my pollutants flowing into your place, or and how so the resolution's important in many cases, but what were the conversations around that, and
sure,
how important is that in the framework?
Okay, so I'll just repeat the question for people online. So the question is around how Māori concerns or interests around scale and scale effects, particularly across landscapes and so forth. I think people will get it. Not a great interpretation of your question, but I know how to answer it. So there's the way in which, so of course what Māori are most concerned with is a mountains to the sea approach. It's a whole of catchment approach, broad landscape approaches, and biome sort of scale approaches. The way I kind of envisage it is, if you could imagine the landscape as a traffic light system of red light, orange light, green light, and if land users who are green light, might be looking pretty good across all the environmental indicators. Those are amber, marginal, and those are red, are points of pollution within the landscape, or points of environmental degradation. The idea being is that, through having broad scale data across the whole catchment, that you're then able to identify, point sources. You're able to have a much better idea of interactions and within that system, and zero down on, not to use a stick on people, but to say, here's the green lights, and how can the amber and reds learn from the greens. So in terms of that Māori perspective, this is that whole of landscape management approach, being able to identify it, because this is often the big issue. It's like we know this is polluted in this area, but we can't identify quite where this is coming in from the environment, whether it's water or whatever it might be. And because of the way we've built our resource management act and processes, we get these aggregation effects, where everyone's taking water consent by consent, and then it's over extraction, or everyone's adding piece by piece, and then we get and so it kind of having broader data that enables us to deal with those effects is pretty crucial. And with that in mind, and that's principally one of the key things driving particularly our iwi feedback from the iwi and so forth, is being able to deal with it in that type of way. Does that answer it? Yeah, cheers.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a comment that also
Yeah.
probably a question. It's interesting that you raise similar issues around collaboration, interoperability, sensitive data, funding, and work stream prioritization to those faced in other sectors. Thanks for sharing.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions online or in the room? I think one of the things that is important here is that in terms of it, as a physical scientist kind of person, there's so much sensing out there at the moment, so many different ways to gather data, but it's not brought together particularly well. I think that's where the gap is. So that's what this project is really sort of like doing, not only within the physical science sense, but also in terms of the mātauranga, bringing everything together into one place so that you can make that better informed decision that you might not have been able to make otherwise. It's not just about using one sensor or another to do one thing, it's about bringing everything together. So that's where the real power is. And I think it's just a massive up ramp at the moment in terms of the amount of satellites up there, amount of sensors available, amount of data. It's actually more than we can handle right now. And so that's what this is trying to get on top of. Let's make better use of what we've got and what's coming.
Yeah, thanks, Matt.
So any other last questions or comments or thoughts? Yes.
I just wonder how easy or how you see that transition between the sensor information and the model outputs, and that being translated into Mātauranga Māori and coming to something that is applicable to my agribusiness, or
Yes.
how that transition goes.
Yeah, well, the thing is that the biophysical type of information that most iwi and Māori agribusinesses want and forestry organisations is very similar, if not the same, as what other entities want as well in terms of that type of information. However, often they want that information packaged differently in terms of how it's communicated. The other thing is, and I did talk about the non-codified forms of knowledge, and that's where a lot of the communication comes in, and in particular how it's processed and thought about. The other thing is the development of the Indigenous artificial intelligence algorithms. So you're actually using, codifying that Indigenous knowledge and being able to, data flowing from a satellite gets scraped by interpreted through an Indigenous pattern recognition type AI that then can generate information that is picking up on those patterns. What else? And then, those personas I went through as well, like each of those, I mean, I probably could have gone into more detail and how that, but into each of them, but would be here for a couple of hours. But the idea being that then the information is then packaged correctly for the various audiences. If you're a farm manager, you want production data, a farm manager of Māori farm. But if you're the ahikai, you're going to want something, quite different in terms of how you're, the type of information you need to satisfy your requirements. Matt, you can probably answer that too, because you were.
What about you mentioned the AI, the indigenously informed AI. What about issues such as data sovereignty in running those AI?
Yeah.
And what capability do we currently have in hosting those AI here?
I,
I mean, this is kind of like a big issue, right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
what are your thoughts on?
So in terms of the process and protocol, it depends on the type of information that's being, the type of AI being generated and whether it was to be protected. If we're looking to be identifying wahitapu or sacred sites or whatever, of course, those algorithms would be embedded and hidden and not publicly accessible. But there may be others where the iwi might be more than happy to share, or it's in the public interest or in their own interest to share. So I think it is going to be a case by case basis on how each is made explicit or made available. In terms of storage, on site in New Zealand, I know the capacity is building here in New Zealand to be able to provide those services, and with data centers being built for that reason. So I think that's all possible. But you've probably got a more informed view than I.
Yeah, there's data centers that are being established, AWS in Auckland, for example.
Yeah,
But whether that addresses fully the data sovereignty issue, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's still a US company.
Yeah.
So there's a lot more than I know about in that space. That is quite challenging. I think.
Yes. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
Any last questions, thoughts, comments online or in the room? Last opportunity. Well, there's still some food at the back for those here. And John, you'll hang around for a little bit, I expect. So
Sure.
we can always carry on those conversations. Thank you for joining online or coming in person. Really appreciate you coming along. We have recorded, so it will be, I think you're going to put it on the website here as well, right?
Yep.
So we'll put it up online. But otherwise, John, thank you so much for your insights into this. It's been really good to have you come and present to the GRI today. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt.
Love my video.